Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Sonja Diaz, and I am the founding director of UCLA's Latino Policy and Politics Initiative. We're here with an esteemed panel of subject matter experts and practitioners to talk about universal vote by mail in the context of COVID-19. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Matt Barreto.
All right, thank you, Sonja, and thank you everyone for joining us. We're really pleased to be hosting this conversation today. As you know, there has been a substantial increase in interest in how to protect our democracy amidst this pandemic. Ideas of moving to universal vote by mail, securing mail ballots, as well as how do we vote in person in a safe and healthy manner. These are just some of the questions that our expert panel is going to be discussing with you today.
There's the belief among many that this is one wave of this virus and then it will dissipate and life will return to normal. But one of the things that we discovered from the medical literature and consulting with experts is that these pandemics typically happen in multiple waves. We're experiencing the first one now. There'll be another in all likelihood behind it. And most of the literature we looked at showed that that next wave would be starting in October, November of next year when the general election started. So with that information, we wanted to envision what were the best methods to employ in voting in this kind of environment. And as you mentioned, we put out a report. It's at uclavrp.org, but it lays out sort of a two-step process. What should voting look like in the future when we have more time to plan? Like Registrar Kelley and the Secretary of State have been able to do in California, and then what must we do immediately to ensure that there are measures in place that allow everyone to vote? We can't cancel our democracy. I think I even saw Leader Mitch McConnell say this morning that we voted in World War I, we voted in the Great Depression, we voted in the Civil War, we're going to vote this year, so how do we make that happen? And in terms of what is accomplishable in the short term, is the first is that all jurisdictions need to make available no excuse vote by mail. Many jurisdictions that already allow vote by mail do so only if there are particular circumstances. Often it's people over a certain age or people who have a disability or some other personal condition. The first step is, at least for this next 6-7 months of elections, we're going to have no excuse vote by mail. We have to take the burden off of in-person voting. Importantly, as part of that, the postage for this mail process has to be included. People always have the barrier of financial cost to vote. To many people, even getting a stamp is a burden. But importantly, folks who can afford stamps often can't get them. There's not a way to get postage at home during social distancing. There's all types of barriers for all people. So the postage part of the problem has to be resolved. We think, and we recommend in our report, that states and jurisdictions should mail a report to every registered voter. Unless that's mandated by Congress, then there are going to have to be some alternatives because some jurisdictions are going to refuse to mail it to all registered voters. So in that case, if there is an option to request, it should be as burdenless as possible. People should be able to request by phone. They should be able to request their mail ballot through a website. And certainly they ought to be able to mail in a request. And it's an all of the above strategy on that point. Another thing is staffing. For those of us who work in elections, we realize that most of the staff is over the age of 65 in many areas. A lot of those folks are precisely the people that shouldn't be out and about right now. And so jurisdictions need to prepare for that. What we recommend in our report is that local, county, city, state employees who are otherwise not emergency employees should be designated now as backup elections.
Yeah. So do I think it's doable to significantly grow vote by mail across the country? Absolutely. In fact, I think fundamentally, we need to get to a point where every voter in America has an opportunity for no excuse vote by mail in every election. So first comes the willingness, first comes the vision, first comes the leadership and the belief that this is essential in a health pandemic or not in a health pandemic, but especially during a health pandemic. And this is something that we can't wait until October to try to start accomplishing.
so that people are less confident in the election system than they have been in decades past. And that would have been true even if we didn't have COVID-19. What COVID-19 has added to this is it's put stress on a system that's already organized in a way that's difficult to manage, which is huge parts of the election process are devolved down to the 3,100 county level governments in the United States, people like Registrar Kelley. Because so many more people will be voting by mail, and I'll leave the discussions of the details to experts like the Secretary of State and the Registrar, but because of that, one of the things that's likely to happen, and I think it's something that the media needs to prepare people for, is we are not likely to know on election night what the results are. That is, people have gotten used to the idea that, you know, the polls close at 8 p.m. and at 8:02, the maps change color on national TV. And if you have a lot of people voting by mail, even if they're required to have the ballots postmarked ahead of election day, and in some states they are, and in other states they're not, by the time those ballots get counted, by the time signatures get verified in states with signature verification and like, it's not going to be the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. It's likely to be quite a bit later that week, and it's really important that people not assume anything about exit polls or polling data, you know, public opinion polls, about what the results of an election are going to be, either nationwide or for some of the local elections.
Thanks.
But the voters reacted, and the voters reacted in a big way. When you look at the March primary numbers from just a few weeks ago, we had about 82% of our voters in the total turnout, which was the highest, by the way, since 2000, that used a vote by mail ballot. Compare that to just a few years ago, which was about 30 points lower. So voters will adapt, voters will accept this, and voters are looking for that opportunity for not only expanded access, but a better experience for the voters. And I don't know if it was fortuitous for us to have this infrastructure in place based on this pandemic, but there are certainly things counties can do in the short term to ramp up and get ready for a November election potentially that could be mostly vote by mail.
So you're right, voting by mail is smart from a voting rights standpoint, a public health standpoint, but it's only as effective as we educate the public and we recognize that it's not just California, it's not just Texas, the whole country is very, very diverse, and we need to communicate to voters in the diversity of languages that make up our beautiful country.
So one of the things I think that we're trying to do with vote by mail is, if you think about in-person voting, it's a little bit like those ventilators that people are talking about. You can't overwhelm it with people, but there are going to be people who need it. And so some of this is trying to flatten the curve of voting by having people vote early or have people vote by mail or dropping off their ballot so that those people who actually do need assistance in casting a ballot for whatever reason can get that assistance either through early voting or on election day itself, because there are a lot of people who are in that kind of position.
You know, we got to be precise when we're talking about this stuff, because most people will say or hear universal vote by mail, and it will be interpreted as vote by mail only. Right? It's important to distinguish, number one, how voters receive their ballot. We're talking and advocating for every voter to be able to receive their ballot in the mail without an excuse. The second part of the process is how the ballot gets returned, right? And as Neal can explain, there's multiple ways for people to return the ballot. You can return it by mail. So one specific thing that we can do to just make sure there's no excuses, no impediments, is for states and counties to cover the return postage, right? The last thing you want is somebody's voting rights, you know, being sacrificed for scrambling for a stamp, right? Can't go to the post office anymore. And number two, in Orange County and many other places, local jurisdictions install ballot drop boxes throughout the region. So it's kind of like a mailbox, but clearly for ballots only, and any voter can drop it off at any drop box in their county, convenient to them. But there's still a need and an important role for that in-person experience that we've been talking about. For people who prefer it, I think that's their right. For people who need assistance, language or otherwise, it's also it's also how same-day registration works, by the way. So we don't want to disenfranchise somebody who's eligible simply because they didn't register so far in advance. So we need to maintain that in-person option only.
Yeah, I think, the secretary mentioned it. You want to make sure there's that good outreach. We have, not just in the Latino community, but in the Asian American community, record numbers of first-time voters, people who are becoming naturalized citizens, people who are turning 18. These electorates are growing very dramatically. And as we think of new voting methods, we need to make sure we're doing that outreach. This is something that civic groups, organizations can be involved in, but you have to have leadership from the top. And so you have to have that outreach coming from either your Secretary of State or your county registrar or county clerk. There needs to be information sent out. They have a list, everybody who is registered to vote. They need to be doing that outreach. And we're lucky here in California, as well as other states on the West Coast like Oregon and Washington, other states like Colorado. They're doing these sorts of efforts. They're doing that outreach. It's not rocket science. It's not impossible. You have those lists of voters. Let's inform the voters so that they have a chance to be heard. And I think a little bit of extra attention needs to be heard to those first-time registrants. When someone comes on the voter registration roll for the first time, let's celebrate that. Let's engage them, especially as we're moving to a new method, perhaps, of vote by mail. So the more outreach, the better. And I think you have a lot of good examples in some of the Western states.
We're talking about vote by mail for a reason. We are living in unprecedented times as it pertains to public health and public health risks. But if we step back and look at the history of our country, Americans have gone to the polls in times of peace, in times of war, in good economic times, in times of economic recession, and yes, even during prior flu pandemics, right? So we got to look first and foremost at the resiliency of our democracy. And while we're in the middle of the presidential primary election season, and some states are postponing their elections or changing how they're going to conduct the primary election, when it comes to the November election, it is not a matter of if, and it is not a matter of when, because we have a date. Tuesday, November 3rd is general election day in America. The question is how we will provide the opportunity for people to vote, because we must and we will, but do so in a way that preserves voting rights and access to the ballot, election security, and public health. And it's through these measures, through these models that we've seen be effective in many states, like vote by mail, that we can do that. But it's not just looking at vote by mail, and I may or may not be comfortable. Let's put it in the context of history, and let's put it in the context of today. Come November, we hope and pray that we have flattened the curve and the pandemic is well behind us, but there is no guarantee. So as elections officials, we can hope for the best, but we got to prepare for the worst. How do we maintain the November election in a way that's accessible but safe and healthy for everybody? I believe vote by mail is a core element of how we could and should prepare, but we can't wait till October to do it. We need to start planning and preparing now.
I have a question for the lawyers on this panel. So if Congress doesn't act and does not act in the way that previous Congresses have, either during recessions, during war, during pandemics, is there an equal protection claim under the 14th Amendment around voting by mail?
So the answer to that is, like almost everything in the law, it depends. And so there are two kinds of claims that could be brought. One is a kind of classic, you are depriving me of my right to vote. And that would be true in states that have some form of vote by mail that a person doesn't qualify for. So for example, in a state where the definition of illness or the definition of disability that the state uses doesn't allow you to say, I'm staying home not because I'm already testing positive for the coronavirus, but because I'm afraid I'll catch the coronavirus if I go to the polls. Those people, I think, have a potential claim under what's called substantive equal protection, but it's really kind of halfway between equal protection and the fundamental rights strand of federal law. Then there are two other kinds of claims that you may see that we haven't seen much of in the past, but I could imagine here. One of them is there are several states that allow for no excuses vote by mail for people over the age of 65. But for people under the age of 65, either don't allow for that at all or require them to produce IDs that older people don't have to produce. The 26th Amendment to the Constitution, which really hasn't been litigated hardly at all, provides that states cannot discriminate, deny, or abridge the right to vote on account of someone's age once that person has turned 18. And the question whether treating voters over the age of 65 differently from voters under the age of 65, particularly in a time of pandemic, that's a very real question, especially if, for example, you have a state that says people over the age of 60 should stay home. So you have people who are under 65, but over the age that the state is telling them not to go out and therefore not to go to the polls. Well, that might be a 26th Amendment question.
The important point is we're not going to cancel our democracy. We are so thankful to Secretary Padilla and Registrar Kelley for their leadership and what they've done in California and the model they provide to the rest of us. And now as we adjourn this call, it's on all of us to double our commitment to democracy and find a way to make this work in all 50 states and territories.
And if you have any final questions or comments, as I said, do not hesitate to reach out. The way that you registered and signed up for this webinar, you can reach all of the experts that are here. We'll be happy to answer additional follow-up questions and interviews. And we thank you again for your commitment to protecting our democracy this year. But as you heard from Secretary Padilla, we have an opportunity to protect it during this pandemic. But this is something that all states should be doing to encourage additional voter participation and engagement. We should be enacting these measures everywhere, every year, to make sure that all voters have a right to vote in the manner that they think is most appropriate.